everybody. Welcome to today's show. My name is Spencer Walsh. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We got a good one for you, as always, and we got a lot of stuff on the plate for today. We started off with this very, very interesting New York Times feature on all things migrant children and labor that they've really been forced into. Under the Biden administration, they go into jobs, the migrant kids, and I guess under the Trump, they just get separated from their parents. It seems to be the only choices that we have here. Meanwhile, the really horrific Ralph Yarl case out of Missouri, where essentially a man has been charged after shooting a black teenager twice. Once for, I guess, apparently for good measure. It's a really horrific story. Who went into the wrong house. This teenager, that was apparently his only quote-unquote crime. Also, some more interesting information coming out of these Pentagon docs regarding the Yemen war and the U.S. intelligence view into the peace talks between Saudi Arabia and backed forces and Iranian backed forces that have really been tearing up that poor country for many, many years now. That's what we got on the docket for today. Going to be a very good and very interesting show. So thank you so much for joining us. So for this first story here, we're obviously going to be borrowing heavily from the New York Times on this one because they have a great feature out on migrant children and some of the really horrific stuff that they've had to deal with. So in the spring of 2021, Linda Brandmiller was working in an arena in San Antonio that had been converted into an emergency shelter for migrant children. Thousands of boys were sleeping on cots as the Biden administration grappled with a record number of minors crossing into the United States without their parents. Brandmiller's job was to help vet sponsors, and she had been trained to look out for possible trafficking. In her first week, 2 cases jumped out. One man told her he was sponsoring 3 boys to employ them at his construction company. Another, who lived in Florida, was trying to sponsor 2 children who would have to work off the cost of bringing them north. She immediately contacted supervisors working with the Department of Health and Human Services, a federal agency responsible for these children. So pretty much saying that, okay, these guys are essentially going to be indentured servants to these random strangers, just for the fact that, just for the bought in the country, they're going to have to, quote unquote, work it off with some people who just happen to be sponsoring them up in all over the place. Whether it be Florida, whether it be a construction company, God knows where. Within days, she received notice that one of those children, who she sent an email about, was just going to be released to the man in Florida. She wrote another email asking for a supervisor's immediate attention, adding the government had already sent a 14-year-old boy to the same sponsor. Ms. Brandmiller also emailed the shelter's manager. She literally, during her lunch break, this woman who was reporting this stuff to the in the process of emailing about these really possible indentured servitude, trafficking style situations going on here. This poor 14-year-old going to work for a construction company. She goes for lunch, comes back, can't get back into the building. She's been fired and has not been told why. She emailed the shelter's manager, but over the past 2 years, when 250,000 migrant children come alone to the U.S., thousands of children have ended up in punching jobs across the country, working overnight in slaughterhouses, replacing roofs, and operating machinery in factories, all in violation of child labor laws. A recent Times investigation has shown, after the article's publication in February, the White House announced policy changes and crackdown on companies that hire children. But all along, there were signs of explosive growth. This labor force and warnings the Biden administration ignored or missed, the Times has found. And I think this is really some pretty interesting stuff, because if you really look at it, if it comes down to it, like, you are looking at a situation where 250,000 migrant kids coming across the border. I guess the numbers of where they landed up, I guess, aren't quite clear yet. But this, I think, it should be considered as a real, crime. But I think in terms of just the general, just the way our broader media culture is structured, it's going to get zero in terms of the pickup, in terms of the play, because people that would care about this, the so-called bleeding heart liberals, are going to be too busy defending their political interests with Joe Biden. So they will, abandon really all principle on this and say, it's not as bad as Trump. You're supporting fascism if you compare what Biden did here to what Trump did. Of course, I think it's obviously not directly comparable. You could, although I would say the intent, because you got to look at the intent here. But I think there was also a certain point to say, Biden advocated for Title 42. He pushed for some of the same policies that Trump pushed for. And intended at least to ignore, the decision to ignore these reports, these decisions that have been moved to various levels up the flagpole, have been pretty damaging, a pretty searing indictment of the Biden administration's big claim to be, fighting for the heart and soul of the nation, making real change, and getting better than Trump. But again, the veteran government staffers and outside contractors told HHS, including reports that reached the desk of Javier Becerra, the secretary, that children appear to be at risk. The Labor Department put on news releases noting an increase in child labor. Senior White House aides were shown evidence of exploitation, such as clusters of migrant children who have been found working with industrial equipment or caustic chemicals. As the administration scrambled to clear shelters that were strained beyond capacity, children released with little support to sponsors expected them to take on grueling or dangerous jobs. The interview with the Times exposed. In interviews with the Times, officials expressed concern for migrant children, but shifted blame for failing to protect them. HHS officials said the department funded sponsors sufficiently, but could not control what happened to children after their release. Monitoring workplaces, they said, was the job of the Department of Labor. And I guess it does kind of bring up the interesting question that I guess we can't really know for sure, because it's so different with loads of people. Like, was this an intentional ideological decision? Was this a way to say, this doesn't matter? Or was it genuine, what was behind this neglect? Was it, a thing to say, we'll probably get away with it, no one's really going to care? Or was it just inherent laziness because of the way that that these people clearly rank migrant children, so low on the totem pole of things to care about? Or is it just because really these government issues, I think it's probably a little bit of both, but I think also a factor is that these government agencies have just been completely picked to the bone. They are just fundamentally not fit for purpose, not fit for enforcement, and just have no real ability to conduct anywhere near the necessary levels of enforcement that would just be in a basic level acceptable or expected under really any other administration or any functioning government or any government that you would be able to, I think, be proud of here. So officials at the Labor Department said inspectors had increased their focus on child labor and shared details with workers about workers with HHS, but it said it was not a welfare agency. So again, we had this kind of two Spider-Man's meme of pointing back and forth and saying, how did this happen? How did this happen? It's a very strange situation that is proving a little bit tough to navigate. But the interesting question is, obviously this is a front page story here in the New York Times, on a Monday night into Tuesday morning, but is this going to be is AOC, for example, to go down to the border and start crying because of this? Is there going to be anywhere of the kind of establishment media backlash reaction that there was towards Trump? And just is that going to define Joe Biden like it did for Donald Trump? Because in my opinion, it really should. This is a real serious, legitimate failing here of something that just was not paid attention to or acknowledged at all. White House officials said that while the two departments had passed along information about migrant child labor, the reports were not flagged as urgent and did not make clear the scope of the problem. So it's just a big comedy of error, just one big mistake. Again, I think any responsible media company here will probe this deeply because it really is. It's really quite a moral outrage. It's just a very awful. Like, I don't see really how one could make the case that this is not on, in some way, the same level of what we've been seeing with Trump, or at least that it should not be analyzed and scrutinized by the media. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there will be a big pickup of this story, which I think is just as much a moral outrage, just as much indicative of a problem in the system as what happened with Trump, what happened with family separations at the border, the detention policy. But I feel like, and it's just really just perfect, for the benefit of these big corporations, the worst employers in America taking advantage of this, like the slaughterhouse factories, things like that. I think that is something that is very, very hard to ignore or to really look past in any way. But we'll see if there's anyone who could do it, it's certain that our media definitely can. All right, we move on to our next story in just 30 seconds.
MC, make another hit.
This ain't what you want. Project. This ain't what you want. This ain't what you want.
You're listening to Newsflash right here on the Spencer Walsh Radio Network. Help us grow our audience. Subscribe, rate, and review our show on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. Thank you very much.
We are taking you today to Kansas City, Missouri, where we have Ralph Yarl. This is a really kind of horrific situation. The New York Times does a really great job of kind of getting us into setting the scene here. The errand, they write, that nearly cost Ralph Yarl his life was a sort that falls to older brothers everywhere. I'm an older brother. I'm the oldest. I've done this kind of stuff before. But Ralph has, a little bit of a different life experience than me. Ralph is a 16-year-old black boy from Kansas City, Missouri, and he'd been sent to pick up his younger twin brothers at a friend's house on Thursday evening, his family said. But he mixed up an address, finding himself in front of a house on Northeast 115th Street instead of Northeast 115th Terrace. Very classic small mistake. Which was like right across the street. It was the street right up the block. It was North 115th Terrace, and he went on to Northeast 115th Street. The white man who answered the door there shot him in the head and again in the arm after he fell, according to prosecutors. Somehow, Ralph made his way bleeding to another nearby house. There, he was told to lie on the ground while someone called for help. His family said, and apparently. Apparently it does seem like the amazing thing is he's in critical condition and fighting for his life now. Very good possibility that he may actually be able to survive, which would really be a remarkable situation because just all these horrible victims of violence, from Ahmaud Arbery to the many people shot by police over the years, they being there to tell their stories after being victims of police brutality, police violence is something that we are not very familiar with, or just general white, racially motivated, possibly violence. Here's a really remarkable part. The homeowner who shot him, named Andrew Lester, was taken into custody by police for 24 hours and released without charges on Friday. Like, what was the thought process on that? I think that's something that should be really examined, to say the least. Protesters marched on Mr. Lester's home on Sunday while the Kansas City police chief, Stacey Graves, acknowledged the public frustration in a news conference. Really remarkable there. The teenager was released from the hospital on Sunday evening, his father said. Really remarkable. Mr. Thompson, is the prosecutor in this. Zachary Thompson is the prosecutor in this case. Publicly identified Lester a few hours into Monday. They identified Lester, and they announced that he had been charged with saying what many already believed, saying that, quote, there was a racial component to this case. Thompson said Lester had been charged with assault in the first degree, Class A felony, and could face life in prison if convicted. He also was charged with armed criminal action, which carries a maximum penalty of 15 years in prison, Thompson said. It was not clear if the teenager had knocked on Mr. Lester's door or rang the doorbell, but he did not cross the threshold into the man's home, Thompson said. The shots were fired from a .32 caliber handgun, and they were fired through the glass door. The prosecutor said, adding there was no indication that any words were exchanged. Just really a remarkable, vicious display of what is clearly here, I think, racial violence. We understand how frustrating this has been, but I can assure you the criminal justice system is working and will continue to work. Thompson has the unenviable job of saying that to a family and probably a bunch of friends who are incredibly pissed off about almost having lost their son, their friend, their older brother, etc. So Lester was not in custody when the charges were announced, but Thompson said the news conference a warrant had been issued for his arrest and his bail had been set at $200,000. I don't have any information regarding specific whereabouts, but it's my understanding law enforcement is aware of the situation and will be taking all appropriate action. The teenager's father, Paul Yarl, went on a phone interview. Said on a phone interview Monday evening that his son underwent surgery over the weekend to remove the bullets. He was able to walk out of the hospital on Sunday evening and expect to make a full recovery. That is just absolutely remarkable. Whether something the glass had something to do with it, but apparently it was a pretty close range shot, and he hit him again as he was falling down. Really, the son's forehead on the side of his face, close to the hairline, he said, and the second hit his right arm. Really remarkable stuff. Yarl said he was relieved the charges were finally announced. He said he was confused that Lester had been allowed to go home and sleep, but his main concern was for other black children. He said he could have repeated it with the next kid that looked like Ralph, he said, which is a very good point. People like this, I mean, it's pretty darn obvious, that this is not, this guy, Andrew Lester, is not alone. There are people like this all over the country who are this worked up and this crazy and this racially, just completely just motivated and torn up by racial hatred. And to top it all off, are incredibly violent and have guns and are just really, really ready to do some harm. Yarl said he had learned that his son had been shot in a call from the boy's mother on Friday morning and drove from his home in Indianapolis to Kansas City, where he visited his son and joined the protests over the weekend. I'm still shocked. He's a good kid, he said, describing his son as an athlete who loves music and video games and excels in the school. The parents, who are Liberian immigrants, have been divorced since 2017. Mayor Quentin Lucas of Kansas City said in an interview on Monday before the charges were announced that he was heartbroken and angry about the situation that we find ourselves in. You've heard about driving while black, Mr. Lucas said, who is black. You've heard about all the issues that black people confront in life. Can you not knock on the door while black? It's almost like you can't exist. Later on Monday, Lucas said on Twitter the charges against Lester were a first step towards justice for Ralph Yarl. And he said he had also spoken with Ralph's mother, shared with her my personal commitment to ensuring we find justice for our son, her family, and all hurting now in our city. The White House said on Monday that President Biden had spoken by phone to Ralph and said he shared his hope for a swift recovery. That must have been a conversation to have, from Sleepy Joe to that poor family. Before the charges were announced, most of the details about the shooting had come from the family members and their lawyers, Ben Crump and S. Lee Merritt, the Kansas City Star, and other media outlets covering the controversy over the release of Lester, who has not yet been publicly identified. So there can be really no excuse for the release of this armed and dangerous suspect after admitting to a shooting an unarmed, non-threatening, and defenseless teenager that rang his doorbell, Crump and Mr. Merritt wrote in a joint statement on Sunday. Crump linked to a fundraising page started by Ralph's aunt, Faith Spoonmore, who wrote that her nephew, a high school junior, did not have his phone with him when he went to get his brothers. He mistakenly went to the wrong house, 1 block away from where his siblings were, she wrote. She said that her nephew pulled into the driveway and rang the doorbell, and the man who came to the door shot Ralph in the head. My nephew fell to the ground, and then the man shot him again, Spoonmore wrote. Ralph was then able to get up and run to the neighbor's house looking for help. Unfortunately, he had to run to 3 different homes before someone finally agreed to help him after he was told to lie on the ground with his hands up. I mean, unbelievable. It's really, frankly, it's a miracle he survives. Like, I mean, this is someone who has just been shot twice, once in the forehead, and is unbelievably able to make it to safety. Like, I'm shocked at this whole situation, but really shocked that he was, but through 3 different houses, people unable or unwilling to help him, or not home or whatever. Chief Graves said on Sunday the police were called to the scene around 10 p.m. During the news conference, an investigator declined to say whether it was the homeowner who had called 911. It'd be interesting to see who called 911 in the first place. The gunman was released after being held for the maximum 24-hour period without charges under state law and a felony investigation, the chief said at the news conference. Chief Graves said the teenager was expected to give a formal statement to investigators when his injuries allow. She said there was also a potential self-defense or stand-your-ground element investigators were examining. Of course, this is from the chief of police. But the following day, Mayor Lucas said Missouri's stand-your-ground law, which was adopted in 2016, should not apply in this case. If stand-your-ground really lets somebody just shoot somebody that rings a doorbell, that puts the life of every postal worker, every campaigner, every Amazon delivery person at risk in this country. And I mean, some places, I'm sure it legitimately is, no matter what. And, we've seen, from the police chief, who knows what her motivations are, who knows what her mindset is on this situation, and who knows how sound her legal analysis is. It seems like the prosecutor seems to be taking this a bit more seriously than her, which is good because he's going to be the more important person in this case. But it is really quite remarkable and encouraging to see this, that there is at least finally now charges being filed, which is very, very encouraging. All right, we move to our last story. Some pretty interesting stuff coming out of Yemen and Ukraine. These leaked Pentagon documents getting the clear thing is that these leaked Pentagon documents were not just about Ukraine. There was some really interesting stuff about Yemen. Ken Klippenstein has that story in The Intercept. We'll get to next.
My name is Spencer Walsh. This is the Spencer Walsh Radio Network, and if you're listening to one of our podcasts, whether it's Newsflash, Hidden History, The Spencer Walsh Show, or something else, ladies and gentlemen, we have one simple request of you. Please be sure to rate us, subscribe to us if you like us, and leave us a comment, because just like all of you, sometimes we need that feedback in our lives, good or bad. We want to hear what you have to say, so please do those steps, make SWR and content better, and thank you so much for listening.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we get into this last story here. Very interesting stuff from Ken Klipsey, kind of reporting on these leaked these leaked Pentagon documents, shedding light on what the United Nations has deemed the worst humanitarian crisis in the world in war-torn Yemen, pitting Saudi Arabia, the richest country in the Middle East, against Yemen, the poorest. The conflict has seen 85,000 Yemeni children die under age 5 of starvation since the conflict began. 85,000. Absolutely awful. The assessment is a window into the strategic calculus of Saudi Arabia and the Houthis, Yemen's de facto ruling tribe. In the final weeks before the Chinese, really, really remarkable situation, the Chinese government coming in here to end what is an absolutely brutal situation that has been going on for quite a long time by coming in and negotiating this peace, something that the fact the U.S. is taking a backseat role and really has been just completely encouraging and just standing by Saudi Arabia as they've just committed all these atrocities, just blowing up school buses, things like that, double tapping Yemen wedding parties with drone strikes. Like, it's just really the United States has just they played the role of just been standing by with Saudi Arabia as they've committed these atrocities, and they have now seemed very, very unlikely or unable or just without the credibility to make peace, which has really allowed China to come in and secure a major diplomatic win here. So you have Chinese government brokering this rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which backs the Houthi movement. Since the détente, Saudis have reportedly agreed to a much more significant concessions that were on offer in mid-February, demonstrating the more direct path to peace was available, given the right diplomatic maneuvering. If successful, the ceasefire bid would put an end to a grinding war that has brought Yemen to the brink of famine. At the time the classified Pentagon memo was written, however, a quick movement to ceasefire agreement seemed a dicey proposition. Part of a cache of Pentagon documents circulating publicly in recent weeks, the document reveals fraught negotiations between Saudi Arabia and Yemen regarding a potential peace agreement. The document describes Saudi Arabia's alleged intention to drag out negotiations, an ominous reminder that even with the month's surprising progress, peace is far from certain. The Department of Defense and the Intelligence Committee are actively reviewing and assessing the validity of photographed documents, according to the NSC spokesperson Rebecca Farmer. The document marked the whole rigmarole there about some are true, some may not be true from the National Security Council. The document marked top secret with the dissemination limited to the U.S. and closest intelligence allies, the so-called Five Eyes. It provides the most detailed glimpse yet into the back-channel conversations unfolding between Houthi and Saudi officials. Titled Houthi Spokesman Receives Update on Saudi Negotiating Process, the document describes negotiations between the parties on issues of Yemen's public sector salaries. The salaries have gone unpaid for several years, leaving the state unable to function. Until this month, apparent breakthrough, Saudi and Houthi leaders have reportedly met for the first time in the Yemeni capital, Sana'a. The government worker payments have been a sticking point, not just for Saudi Arabia, but it's for its U.S. allies as well. The Houthi demands that Saudis pay public sector salaries, including military and security workers, were considered by the Biden administration to be beyond the pale. In an October press briefing, Tim Lenderking, U.S. envoy for Yemen, decried what he called the Houthis' maximalist demands, insisting salary payments to be paid first to the Houthi military and security personnel. It was, he said, a threshold that was simply too hard for the other side to contemplate and was entirely unreasonable. Yet that's precisely what the parties have agreed to following Chinese reconciliation. It wasn't that the deal was impossible, it was that the U.S. did not want it. And I think that's a pretty interesting situation, and shows you that, you can't have these people coming out and saying, who really have been funding and, it just completely exposing here the United States as unable to negotiate peace and be a force for peace anymore, because they've always been kind of funding various sides, picking sides in conflicts more than really any other country has in the past, in the post-war era, the post-World War II era. But it really now seems that they just don't have the diplomatic clout. They don't have the just raw power, the awesome might, just come in and say, you know what, this is what you're doing. You're just going to have to accept it. Come on, let's go. Let's wrap this up. It's over when I say it's over. The Saudis are clearly in the ear of the United States diplomats here, saying, this is not going to be enough. We don't want it. Or maybe it's a decision coming from the U.S. themselves. But this, China just got those concessions. They said, these demands aren't maximalist, like Saudi Arabia should pay them. They should deal, and do what it takes to end this war, or whatever. They got the job done here when the United States was fundamentally unable to, because the United States has an interest. They've been helping, they've been arming, they've been fueling this conflict by arming one side of it. Which is really, really remarkable. The newly revealed intelligence report makes clear that there were contacts between the two parties over salary payments weeks before the Sunday, April 9th meeting in Sana'a. According to the document, in mid-February, Saudi ambassador to Yemen, Mohammed bin Saeed al-Jaber, privately updated the Houthi spokesperson Mohammed Abdul Salam on Riyadh's negotiating position. He laid out two options for paying the Yemeni public salaries in stages, allowing an independent body to assess the nearly decade-old roster of government employees before paying all workers. As the intelligence report notes, the Houthis' patience was wearing thin, and the Saudis may have had no intention of cutting a deal at the time. Houthi intelligence source apparently assessed that if the Saudis issued a strong statement, it would increase. Houthi intelligence source apparently assessed that if the Houthis issued a, quote, strong statement, it would increase pressure on the Saudis, as the Saudis intend to drag out negotiations and avoid making further commitments about payments. The document states, referring to the possibility the Houthis make strong demands on salary payments. The consultant warned that the Houthis' patience was misunderstood, and the Saudis hoped to gradually increase Houthi demands based on a belief that the Houthis were under pressure and in need of a détente on humanitarian issues before the beginning of Ramadan on the 22nd of March. The account contrasts sharply with the sunny public rhetoric from the Biden administration at the time. On April 2nd, President Biden issued a statement touting a one-year anniversary of a temporary truce signed as a significant milestone. Though the truce had formally expired, full-fledged fighting between the sides had not yet resumed. Biden said a truce has saved countless Yemeni lives and set conditions for a comprehensive peace. Experts, though, say the direct war fighting accounts for a far smaller portion of Yemen's death in the blockade imposed by Saudi Arabia, and the groundwork has not been laid for a truly comprehensive peace agreement, because the fighting in there is not really that crazy. You know, it's Saudi Arabia military is just not that special, only really being supplied pretty much entirely by the United States. And, you know, what they are doing is using their vast wealth to completely cut off the Houthi government from any sort of major resources, and that's why the people are starving, people are dying in a massive clip, especially young children. And with that being said, you know, that puts a lot of pressure on the Saudis, and how the U.S. is clearly, it comes down again, not at all interested in the peace process. While thousands of Saudi airstrikes have caused vast devastation over 8 years, the primary suffering of Yemenis today is Saudi blockade that imports many The primary cause of Yemenis today is the Saudi blockade on imports of many basic goods that amounts to collective punishment against innocent Yemenis. Eric Sperling, director of Just Foreign Policy, told The Intercept, adding the average Yemeni has not seen much real benefit from the ceasefire. The U.S. had long condoned the Saudi resistance to lifting the blockade. The goal was to apply extreme pressure to the Houthis in the ultimate peace agreement, so the Houthis would agree to an inclusive government that left a role open for U.S. and Saudi-backed proxies. But in the wake of the China-backed detente, the Saudis have largely been willing to abandon their proxies in the interest of ending what has been a pretty draining war. The U.S. has responded with alarm, rushing diplomats to the region to assist pressure. The pressure continued to be applied to the Houthi government in hopes of undermining a new deal in the works. Leonard King rushed to Riyadh on April 11th as news broke of a possible peace deal to remind the Saudi leaders of the U.S. desire that they continue to back their proxies in the war. So saying really, you know, the U.S. saying actively, Saudi Arabia saying, you know, not that we really want to stop this war, but we're pretty much tapped here. You know, we got to take a chill pill. But you know, U.S. is like, this is why we sell you weapons so that you use them. Like, come on. And this is not so fast here. You know, we still need to A, hurt Iran and hurt Iran's influence in Yemen, and B, you know, we need to continue this war. We need to keep our arms coming. Instead, the ceasefire talks really appear to have become possible because of an agreement in principle that Saudi Arabia would abandon its puppet government, back down from the blockade as the Houthis hope, and use its vast oil wealth to pay Yemeni civil servants. And why did it happen? Because of China. Sorry, United States. Anyway, on that note, we will say so long and return to you on Wednesday.